listening to an interview that was recorded before the military coup in Myanmar. As many listeners know, after the coup took place, we transformed our mission to respond to the urgent needs at the time. We're now going back through these previously recorded interviews, which largely focus on meditation and the spiritual path, and releasing them now. This is quite a rich conversation which follows, and let's get into that. I'm delighted to be speaking today with Venerable Sumano. Venerable Sumano is a Buddhist monk at Empty Cloud Monastery in New Jersey. Today's discussion focuses on his background leading up to his monastic ordination, and also more generally explores how the Buddhist teachings can inform our understanding of social justice. I hope that today's discussion, as well as the other episodes in this series, can be a platform for continued conversations that examine entrenched protocols, practices, and biases within the vipassana and mindfulness communities. I encourage listeners to take a chance to hear our previous episodes. So with that, Bhante Sumano, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Right. So let's get right to your story. I understand you're originally from Kingston, Jamaica. Can you tell us a bit about your upbringing?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in Jamaica, in the capital city, which is Kingston. And I guess in some ways, I don't know how many people are familiar with Jamaica other than Bob Marley, for example. But I had a pretty typical, I guess, childhood. I lived with my grandmother and my father for the most part, and he was a doctor, and so I had a pretty typical everyday life, going to school and kind of just doing the things that kids do. In Jamaica, though, so the context was a bit different. Um, but yeah, my experiences growing up were um, living for the most part somewhere, thinking about, sort of the topic of our conversation, somewhere where everyone was more or less like me in some ways.
Mhm.
Um, there were obviously things that were different, but having that sort of comfort as far as the culture was concerned made growing up easier. I don't think it's easy for anybody,
Mhm.
especially adolescents. But yeah, for the most part, it was a easygoing childhood, as you can imagine, on a tropical island.
Mhm. Right. And when you talk about it being kind of a typical life for growing up in Jamaica, I've actually never been there
Mhm.
myself. And I'm curious what the religious life was of your family and if you grew up in a
Mm.
religious home.
Well, I guess actually in that respect, that was atypical. So my father was atheist for the most part. At least that's what he said. Which, in contrast to the culture at large, Jamaica is a mostly Christian culture, and I'm not sure which denomination is the most prominent. It's not Catholicism per se, but I think Anglicanism or maybe Baptist churches are the most prominent there. But as far as the culture is concerned, it's a mostly Christian nation. But my family was not religious, and so we didn't have any typical religious practices or spiritual beliefs or even any cultural sort of rituals or traditions that we followed that revolved around that. The most that we would do was Christmas, but for us, Christmas was just putting up a tree, which seems a little strange in Jamaica,
Mhm.
and having like dinner and gifts. So there was no church, there wasn't prayer or anything like that. So for the most part, actually, I was raised without a religious upbringing. And it wasn't until I was a teenager when I realized that that was not normal in Jamaica, that I would like
Mm.
ask my friends. I was like, "Oh, you like do this church thing? Like, what's that about?" And so I became more curious then, I guess, about that dimension of people's lives.
Right. So, as you were growing up in a pretty non-religious home in your childhood and adolescence, did you start to develop an interest into certain kinds of religious material or spirituality or anything like that?
It was pretty general, I guess, if you will. So more just an interest in something that for some people was an integral part of their lives and for me wasn't. So it was I was more curious in like seeing what that was about. So obviously because in Jamaica there's less of a separation, if you will, between, say, church and state. So religion is sort of interwoven with the way that politics goes and the way that people sort of talk about how one should live their life. And so, just in school, for example, we would say grace before eating. Everybody would say that, like in prep school, primary school, elementary school, through high school. But that was to me that was just like, oh, that's just like what we do. So I
Mhm.
didn't have like it didn't resonate with me, and I also didn't necessarily see it as Christian per se until I guess, had the realization when I was a teenager that that's what it was. And so then it was this, okay, like, what's this about? And why are so many people into this? What does this mean? How does this impact people's lives? Um, and honestly, actually, in the beginning, I was pretty, maybe like sort of every rebellious teenager, I was pretty soured by what I concluded, I guess, based on my teenage observations as far as
Mhm.
religion was concerned. Because for me, at least the way that I had heard it and interpreted what was being said, it was being used as something to oppress certain people or to mm, criticize, judge, and diminish the lives of others, especially LGBTQ people.
Mhm.
In Jamaica in particular. And so that for me was a major turnoff. And so I think in some ways I opened the book to see what everything was about, and then I was like, okay, this is not this is not for me. I'm gonna do my own thing, if you will, and that's how I sort of left things through high school.
Right. So you're raised in a pretty non-religious family in a somewhat religious country, and as you explored religious and spiritual matters yourself, you kind of stayed non-religious at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So then in 2007, you left Jamaica to go to New York to attend university there. What was that
Yeah,
experience like?
it was very interesting. It was interesting because my whole teenage life, I had, which I've come to now appreciate as maybe very universal, the whole, oh, wouldn't it be great to just leave my hometown and finally go somewhere where there's different people and all these new things? So, New York City, obviously, seemed like the best place for that.
Yeah.
Um, and my mom actually had been living in New York State in Long Island for a while, working there as a nurse. So it seemed like it made sense to be close to her and then also to go to the big city or near to the big city anyway. Um, and so before I left, it was, a process of idealization, I guess, fantasizing about what the perfect life in this cosmopolitan city would be like versus, my sort of like backwater hometown,
Hmm.
where everyone's kind of the same and everything's the same. And so leaving, there was so much excitement there. And of course, the reality, though, is so much different. I ended up going to university on Long Island, Stony Brook University, which is Stony Brook itself is a little town on Long Island. And I loved my experience there, but it was definitely not, what I had fantasized, say, strutting through New York City as like a 20 something college student or whatever. It was very meaningful, but it was also an adjustment in terms of culture shock. Not just the cold, not just learning new things and meeting new people, but also sort of adjusting to um, a different way of life, which is hard to put into words.
Yeah, I imagine. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like the classic story of someone going from the small town countryside to the big city. Of course, in your case, it's amplified by culture shock
Mhm.
and just a different, as you said, you where you came from in Jamaica, uh, you fit in more with how everyone looked and acted, and so then in New York, it's of course the diversity there is much greater than what you're probably accustomed to back in Jamaica. So I can imagine it was an adjustment on multiple levels.
Oh yeah, totally. And there was more of a need, at least an internal need, to find my niche, if you will, because
Sure.
there was so much actually that,
Hmm.
period,
Hmm.
that it was like, okay, well, now where do I fit in this new world? And so there was a lot of yeah, searching there. I would say a lot of figuring out and actually having to question too, well, okay, well, what is it that I actually want? And now that I have the opportunity to sort of decide in a way where to place myself, where to fit in, well, what am I going to do with that choice that I have? So there was so much like going on at that time.
Yeah, I imagine that. And so, where did you find your place to fit in and your kind of activity and
Mhm.
crowd that suited you?
I ended up, I guess for the most part, I landed at the college newspaper. So I'd always liked writing and I was very interested in stories of people's lives. And so I was interested in journalism and sort of non creative nonfiction narratives about people's lives, whether they were fiction or nonfiction. And so that sort of made me end up at the school newspaper there at Stony Brook. And just from participating more in that sort of club, that organization, and meeting people through that, that was where I sort of formed my friend group that sort of took me through college for the most
Hmm.
part.
And then you
Mhm.
stayed on in New York after graduating?
Yeah. While I was in college, I actually spent a year in Madrid in Spain, on an exchange program there. And that was also a real transformational experience for me, living sort of abroad and living again in a totally new culture. Um, and sort of going from in so growing up in a more or less homogenous society where I was part of that um, homogeneity, so to speak, then going to a heterogeneous society where I was, just one of the mix, and then spending a year in another more or less homogenous society, but where I was not part of the core makeup of that group, and so that was like an interesting experience as well. I guess there's a part of me that liked that shifting of circumstances.
Right. Right. And so then what did you do after New York after you graduated?
So I stayed around in New York for for a while. I ended up I got a degree in Spanish language and literature, and then I got my teaching license. So I started teaching in New York City. So I still had dreams of the city
Mm,
life.
mhm, mhm.
And I ended up living in New York City, and teaching there. Um, for a while. So through till a couple years ago, actually. Yeah, I was teaching Spanish and
Mhm,
as well as English as a second language, and I was
mhm.
teaching this to middle school students at a large public school in Manhattan.
I was just curious about what your experience was like being a teacher, teaching at public schools, how
Mm.
you enjoyed that profession.
I really liked it. I think because again, I sort of I don't know. I was just so interested in humans and how humans work, if
Mhm,
you will, that teaching a language and teaching a language to children who were sort of at that stage of really discovering what the world was about, there was something really fulfilling about that and really interesting about that. There was something about teaching Spanish in particular. Teaching a different perspective or something new or something different than what they had encountered for a while. For a lot of them, it was the first time they were learning a foreign language, so that
mhm,
novelty um, was there. And then teaching English to mostly immigrant students was also super fulfilling because then that was the perspective of kids who really like needed this language to survive actually and to um, also sort of find their place in this huge crazy adolescent foreign land.
mm,
And in some ways it reminded me of kind of like what I went through when I moved here for the first time, so there was also that
mhm.
connection. So yeah, I really liked working with those populations and doing that and having that sort of common
Yeah,
mission with me and my colleagues.
yeah, it's interesting hearing your story because the check marks that you're hidden in your life, it's just so parallel to my own journey as well. So I'm just
Mm.
really reflecting on that, hearing that, and that this is all happening before in both our respective lives. We've kind of found Buddhism, which we're getting into next. But
Yeah.
I grew up in Northern California, rurally, and also had the similar desire to want to get out and see something more.
Mm.
I ended up, you went from Jamaica to New York. I ended up going after I graduated college to Tokyo. So that was a
Oh.
completely different experience. You mentioned studying abroad in Madrid. I studied abroad in Paris. I also studied journalism in college, and that was kind of my big thing. And I liked it to tell stories about people, which is what we're doing right here, telling your story.
Yeah.
And then I was an English teacher for most of my career, and then I was an English teacher trainer. So I also had that whole background. So it's just as I'm listening to this, it's quite interesting how we're hitting these same check marks up into the time that maybe we're searching for something or on some kind of spiritual journey. Maybe we
Yeah.
wouldn't call it that at the time, but in trying to learn more about other people and culture and profession, and then getting up to this point where we first start getting interested in Buddhism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get to that. So jumping to 2016, I think that's when, right around the time you first started getting into Buddhism. And what led you to that
Yeah.
interest?
It was. I mean, I at the time I would say by happenstance. Now I would say not so much by happenstance.
Hmm. Hmm.
But actually, just an acquaintance, not even a friend of mine, just somebody that I had met um, randomly. I saw they were reading a book. It was actually a book about Taoism, the Tao of Pooh, like Winnie the Pooh. I don't know
Right.
if you're familiar.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was curious. I liked reading, and so not having actually not explored Eastern religions up until that point, it was just interesting for me. So I read that, and there was something intriguing about it. And I just remember putting in Goodreads, and this was in this must have been either late 2015 or like January 2016. But I remember putting in Goodreads, like that I had read this book, and then it suggested a book by the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh.
Hmm.
And it was a book called How to Sit.
Mm.
And I remember seeing the title. It was like How to Sit. Like I already know how to sit. um, Not knowing obviously the sort of Buddhist dimension of the title. But anyway, it caught my attention, and I read it, and it completely, I don't know, something clicked inside of me. It's maybe a 40-page booklet, actually, so small with just little snippets of quotes from Thich Nhat Hanh. But I remember reading it, and the first page, I still remember the quote, was everything is impermanent. This moment passes, that person walks away, happiness is still possible. And I remember just really taking that in and like, whoa, okay, this
Mm.
person has something to say. And from there, I probably read all of the existing Thich Nhat Hanh books at the time. But I also just my interest in Buddhism in particular just like took off. So within like a couple of months, actually, I was signing up for my first retreat at the end of 2016. I was sort of uh, yeah, I was ready. I was ready to like dive right in. And in particular, it had come at a time when I had enjoyed teaching and that was going well, but there was um, something that felt was missing, I guess. I was getting to the point
Mhm.
where I was sort of, I guess I was in a rut, if you will. There was some part of what I was doing where it just felt like I was going through the motions each day, and I don't know if that was because I was getting used to just what I was doing, or also because the administrative side of teaching in public school was getting to me. And so that was a particular time in my life where I was really questioning, like, okay, is this something that I want to do for 40 years or something like that? Because that's the trajectory that you sort of have when you have a career. You retire in that career, or is there something else that I want to do? And so, while I was sort of reflecting on that, I encountered the Dharma, and it didn't immediately give me an answer, but it made me realize that the questions that I was asking, or the questions I was asking, were valid. They weren't questions that just needed to be like set aside and, don't worry about that, just go to work and do your thing. It made me realize that those feelings were actually pointing to um, a meaningful search that I had.
Right. And as you went to conduct that search, I know you had read that you'd read all these books by Thich Nhat Hanh. You went to Blue Cliff Monastery for some retreats there. And how was that experience? And what other kinds of retreats or monasteries or practice centers or traditions were you getting involved with
Mhm.
at that time?
So my first retreat at Blue Cliff Monastery, yeah, was that December. So 2000, yeah, it would have been 2016, 2017. It was a New Year's retreat. And I remember I still have good friends that I met and we became friends on that retreat. Um, we were all sitting in a meditation hall one night and we were meeting with one of the monastics. Basically, everyone was just crying. It was like a young people's group in like it was a large retreat, maybe 200 people, and they had split us up into different groups, I think by age, for the most part. So I was in the 20 something group, and we were all just suffering so much with relationships, with
Hmm.
questions about where our lives are going, with family, with this, that, and the other thing. Um, but I remember feeling that, at least in my experience, it was one of the first spaces I'd encountered where that was okay, where it was okay to be experiencing something, to be experiencing something pretty uh, awful, actually, just terrible, and to be okay with the fact that that was happening. Not okay
Mm.
necessarily that you know you want to stay in that place, but that was what was going on for all of us in the moment, and in that moment, that was fine. And I remember during one of the Dharma talks, one of the monastics saying um, that yeah, that's actually the first noble truth. That is the truth of pain, the truth of dissatisfaction, of suffering. And if you try to deny that, then you're just, heaping more suffering on top of yourself. And so my whole life prior to that point, it had been sort of this like, okay, well, I'm feeling this way, but I shouldn't feel that way, or I need to fix this, or I need to just get on with it. And so that moment of stopping, which is a central teaching for Thich Nhat Hanh, for me was life changing, actually.
Mm. Right.
And yeah, from there, it just made sense to keep going to Blue Cliff and to also um, explore different traditions. So I also gained a lot of interest in the discourses of the Buddha, so the Pali Canon in particular. And that led me to reading more work by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, which
Hmm.
then got me interested in the Thai forest tradition and Theravada practice. So it was like things just started expanding. And so I spent some time at Wat Metta, actually, in California,
Oh,
Thanissaro
right,
Bhikkhu's
right.
monastery,
Hmm.
just a week or 10 days, I believe. And also exploring some of the other retreat centers like Barry, um, what do they call it? Center for
IMF.
Buddhist Studies in
Hmm.
Massachusetts, next to IMS, yeah. And also Buddhist Insights in Rockaway, Queens.
Right. So you were traveling, going to all these various monasteries, reading everything you could, and
Mm.
you somehow landed at Empty Cloud. So, having had touches at so many different schools of Buddhist teachers and traditions, this is the one you end up choosing to stay with. So, what
Yeah.
attracted you to Empty Cloud Monastery?
I guess it was kind of that. It was the fact that I was interested in many different flavors of Buddhist practice. So I liked the Thich Nhat Hanh, Plum Village, um, Mahayana style of practice. But I also very much appreciated and was inspired by the Theravada tradition, in particular the practice of the Thai forest tradition.
Hmm.
Um, but both were appealing to me, and for different reasons. And I also realized that for myself, it wasn't necessarily one or the other, or even both, but that each one at a different time in my life was useful,
Hmm.
one way or another, whether it was community practice or individual practice. more sutta, discourse-based practice, or more devotional practice. It didn't matter necessarily what the practice was, but rather what was beneficial for me. What did I need at the time? And so, Empty Cloud Monastery in particular embraces that sort of multifaceted view of the Dhamma. So, sense that it's not about necessarily committing to one tradition or one lineage or one even meditation method, but rather seeing what's useful in any in every form of traditional Buddhism and using that to be happier, to reduce suffering, to be compassionate, and to help others. And I think that's actually the biggest thing that drew me here. Just that sort of all embracing, all encompassing sort of reach that they have for the Dhamma.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I can definitely identify with that. As you stated, Empty Cloud, you decided not just to practice as a lay meditator, but you eventually renounced the householder life entirely. You were ordained as a full bhikkhu. So, how has this informed your spiritual journey? Why did you feel the need to ordain instead of continuing to practice there as a lay yogi?
Yeah. Um, well, I can credit Bhante Sumano, who's my preceptor, my mentor, for giving me maybe a kick instead of a push.
Hmm.
But it actually, since I uh, went to Blue Cliff Monastery, so the first time that I was at Blue Cliff Monastery, just backtracking a little bit, that was actually when I had the first spark that I wanted to be a monastic. I don't necessarily think that's unique. I know there's a lot of people who the first time they encounter a monk, um, who they see as peaceful, who they see is happy, is living a simple and content life, there's this feeling like, oh, I want that, if I just ordain or if I become a monk, then I can have that. And so I think there was some of that there, but there was definitely something that just like uh, felt like that's what I needed to be doing. And so I had that feeling and I didn't act on it at the time, but it kind of just like percolated, if you will. So even though I kept, doing what I was doing, working and practicing as a layperson, I still sort of had in the back of my mind, like, well, it would be nice one day at some point, maybe to try that. And um, since then, like since 2016, it was just this sort of like at some point when I'm ready, when everything is like perfect, I'll give it a shot. So last summer, 2019, while I was staying here doing residency, I was just talking to Bhante Sumano, who I've known for a couple of years now, and sort of talking about the same sorts of things, like, oh yeah, it would be nice to ordain, at some point. Life's pretty good right now. I don't need to rush. And I remember him saying, at some point your good karma is going to run out.
Hmm.
He has this way of saying these really pointed
Right.
things that really nudge me, at least, in the right direction. I was like, okay, because there I was, just like enjoying my nice little place and the nice little job that I had, and the comforts of lay life, if you will. So it didn't necessarily seem that dire to give that up necessarily and ordain. Um, but even though that didn't necessarily like trigger anxiety in me or anything like that, but it did make me remember, and this was something I'd known obviously from reading the Buddha's teachings and practicing, that sort of waiting for the perfect moment was never going to come. The perfect moment was never going to come.
Right.
And with everything that was happening in 2019, or at least beginning to happen, COVID, and then through 2020, um, it kind of threw into, I guess, sharp relief the impermanence, precariousness of life, everything. And so, yeah, last summer, I realized that if I wanted to give this a shot, then now was the time to do it. In the middle of the pandemic, go figure.
Mm.
But this very real sense that if I didn't do this now, who knows, what would happen tomorrow, next month, next year. Um, is this something that I want to regret not having actually tried and done? And so there was a lot of difficulty for me in terms of letting go. But there was a lot of support from Bhante Sumano and Ayasoma, in, yeah, really actually seeing that I didn't have anything to lose, but I had a huge amount to gain. Um, and so I did it.
Mm. What was difficult to let go of?
I would say it was my stuff, but it wasn't that. That's what I would have liked it to have been, actually. That I wish it could have just been that. But it was actually letting go of s- letting go of certainty, even though it wasn't real certainty. Letting go of, I knew that I was doing this every day, and by doing this, I would have like these results: going to this job, having these friends, doing this sort of mundane pattern. There was some safety there, whereas I knew that sort of giving that up and entering renunciant life, you kind of have to finally accept, even though whether you accept it or not, it's true. But you have to accept impermanence. You have to accept uncertainty. So I had to give up the illusion. I had to give up the illusion of um, being able to line my life up exactly how I wanted to do it. And that was difficult. It was also interesting because for me, something I had to also let go of, and this is more personal, I don't know if other people experience it, but I had to let go of living a life that other people wanted me to live, which is
Mm.
very interesting because it seems like something that people would give up easily or happily. Um, but for a good chunk of my life, I'd sort of done the things that, yes, they made me happy, but they also satisfied what my parents wanted me to do and what my friends expected of me, and sort of this sort of societal pressures, career, retirement fund, um, that kind of thing. And so going forth, you have to actually say, "Oh, I don't want those things anymore. This is how I'm going to live my life. This is what I'm going to do." And for me, that was very difficult because I was horrible at setting boundaries, still am to some degree. So to actually say, to my family, "This is what I want to do, even if it's not what you want me to do." To say to my friends, no more happy hour, no more, late night runs to Wendy's or things like that. This is now what I want to do. To say that I'm changing and I'm actually moving away, physically and not physically, was huge for me, because then I had to let go of trying to always meet people's expectations.
Yeah, sure. That reminds me. I read a biography of an American monk or an American meditator who became a monk in Burma. And upon wearing the robes, one of the things he said I always remembered was that it was something to the extent of now I know who I am and everyone else does too. Like now by wearing
Mm,
these robes, I have fit into something where this is who I am and what I do in the world. And living in Burma, this isn't true so much of living outside of a Buddhist country where these things
mhm.
aren't so well known, but in a Buddhist country where just merely wearing the robes, you enter into a kind of social contract in terms of how you're supposed to behave and act in your duties and then what society then owes to
Yeah.
you. That he said just wearing these robes, it immediately stated to everyone who he was and what he did, and what his intentions were. And that was just a profound sense of identity he'd never felt before, of just how explicit and obvious it was.
Yeah, totally. I remember in the fall, I was just walking through one of the parks near the monastery, and this little kid, maybe two, I don't know what age kids start to speak, but he was very small. And he just started shouting, "A monk, a monk!" And it took me a second, but then I realized he was talking about me.
Oh.
And
Mm.
then, yeah, there was a similar moment of like, oh, okay, yeah, people just can look, and not everyone recognizes a monk, obviously, in this country, in the US. But even here, yeah, having that recognition just from simply um, what you're wearing, it was definitely, yeah, it was very humbling, but also very inspiring.
Yeah. And so, how did your parents and your friends take to your decision of ordination?
My best friend saw it coming, as he does like a lot of these things. Maybe not in this uh, particular way, but he knew I was into Buddhist practice and that I liked simplicity and renunciation to some degree, and so it just seemed like a natural progression. Um, my parents are happy with it. I don't know if they necessarily saw it coming, but they came to visit me here actually a couple months ago. And they were really, yeah, they were really happy. They were happy that I um, was happy. And they also appreciate the practice and really what it signifies and what it's about. So yeah, I had all these horror stories in my head about how they would react, and none of them came true. And similarly with my friends who were just happy that I was doing something for me, actually. And I remember one of them
Mhm.
saying, like, just explicitly saying that it was very inspiring to see somebody who knew something that they wanted to do and who went and did it. And it seemed like a simple thing to me, but to him, it was like actually profound that someone can do that. Someone could actually go after something they
Sure.
truly want.
Sure, sure. And how has your spiritual practice shifted from being a lay meditator into a monk? Have you noticed some kind of change or shift in the way you approach things?
Totally. I think even after, like, after the day after I ordained, in a lot of ways, um, there was a lot of relief. So, letting go, you do let go of physical things and you do let go of expectations and worries and all of that. But letting go of doing certain meditations, for example, there would sometimes be the instruction of, oh, put down all your burdens, just let go and come to the present moment. And obviously, as a layperson, I had done that as much as I could, and I had a lot of results. But now, as a monk, for some reason, the instructions they land so much differently, where it does seem even more possible to actually let go and put down my burden, so to speak, where it does seem more doable to actually just sit there and just let everything fall away. And a lot of that has to do with simply that I'm not carrying all the things that I used to carry in that way. And so, as far as like meditation practice, that's helped a lot because then my mind settles much more easily. But a lot of the other changes are almost intangible. They're not things that you like read in a book and you see like, oh, okay, when you become a monk, you'll get this, but as a layperson, you can't. Like, it's not that. It's more that um, as a monk, I feel like I can look at things with a little more perspective and also um, experience what it's like to be dependent on other people's generosity, which I don't think is something you can really understand until you're in that situation. And that's something that has a profound effect on the mind, I found, where it stops being about, I guess, me and my little self and all the things that I need to do, but rather how every action that I take actually not just impacts myself, but impacts the people around me. So it's been very
Right.
interesting.
Right, right. And speaking about your daily monastic life and some of your experiences there, I want to segue to a story that you wrote about the disappearance of a rescue chicken, Hema. This is a chicken the
Yeah.
monastery takes care of. So you eventually found some gray feathers on the compound, and you
Mm-hmm.
concluded that she must have been eaten by a fox or a raccoon or a
Mm-hmm.
hawk. This, along with the subsequent death of another hen, Yamaka, had
Mm-hmm.
a profound effect on you. And you reflected on these incidences. You tried to find the Dhamma wisdom and a loss of life and companionship.
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote the following quote: Buddhists are supposed to contemplate the sheer unpredictability of life in each waking moment. It is the teaching of anicca, the teaching of impermanence. And while we can be very adept at quoting theory and concepts, for most of us, they remain just that, ideas with no real meaning in our lives. That is, until something happens that we simply can't ignore, end quote. So I find the meaning you derive from this incident insightful on multiple levels. First, there's this identification with animals and how, just like us, they also yearn for safety and well being, like any
Mm-hmm.
living creature. I can really identify with this, actually. This is actually another parallel that you and I share. Many years ago, I had a somewhat traumatic experience living in Yangon that happened to me personally. And
Mm-hmm.
afterwards, I was sitting in this taxi by myself, just contemplating what had happened to me. And while I was doing that, this truck pulled alongside me with several hundred chickens that were hanging upside down. They were all
Mm-hmm.
still alive, but likely they were on their way to be slaughtered.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was sitting there, kind of in my own trauma and pain, I made this eye contact with a few of them as we were stuck in traffic. And I
Mm-hmm.
felt this odd connection, like we were both stuck at that moment, resigned to our respective fates. So I don't know if the chickens knew what was coming, but they certainly had some understanding that they were tied by their feet and hanging upside down. And I'm sure it was no fun position to be in. So anyway, it was just a profound moment for me in realizing that this pain of like extreme unsatisfactoriness was being shared across species at the time. There was no real difference in our emotional pain. So it was interesting for me to read about yet another encounter between man and chicken and the Dhamma lesson that results from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That's something that, yeah, I'd actually, before coming to the monastery, I'd never been around chickens like that. I only knew chickens as food, unfortunately, or, seeing, say, PETA ads or animal rights activists talk about chickens. Um, but it wasn't until actually living with them, if you will. They lived outside in a coop, but they were free roaming, free range. And really, day in, day out, seeing their personality, seeing their, um, there's the word humanity that we ascribe to, feelings and emotions and um, intentions and all of that. But um, chickens have humanity, so maybe we need to sort of change that word
Right.
Um, but to see how, yeah, just like us, they had everything we had in terms of wanting to live and wanting to be happy. And so that moment, yeah, it was a real realization for me because the day before, they're doing what they usually do, just try to get our leftovers or get treats when we eat outside, um, to like them being gone, actually, to them
Hmm.
dying.
Hmm.
And in light also actually of everything that was happening in 2020, it was like, again, it was like an, oh, right, I'd forgotten, um, that this is how things are. And just, I guess, like your moment in the taxi too, it
Hmm.
was this feeling of universality of it as
Hmm.
well, um, of seeing like, oh, okay, yeah, this is something, that everyone actually goes through. As Ayasoma likes to say, trembling together. Um, so yeah, with animals, I've realized, and I've actually my whole life had sort of this affinity or appreciation for the sentience of animals. Realized that, well, one, we're animals too, but that they're not different from us at all.
Right, right. And then there's the second layer of the Dhamma wisdom you reference in that quote I want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned how many of us are not really propelled to think deeply about suffering, and quote, until something happens that we cannot ignore, end quote. So,
Mm-hmm.
reading these words, I couldn't help but think about what happened last year following the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others.
Mm-hmm.
Many white Americans had been choosing not to really think very deeply about this pain of racism, but these deaths were pretty much the definition of a wake up call, or, as you say, your quote again, something we simply can't ignore. So at the
Mm-hmm.
time these events were happening, you were a Buddhist monk living in America. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
really curious about your perspective on the social justice movement that mushroomed around this time.
Yeah, it was. Oh, 2020 was a year.
Sure was.
um, there's a lot to say. One of the things that became, I guess, really apparent, and I guess I allude to that a little bit too in my little essay. Um, it was apparent that a lot of Buddhist practitioners, even ones who had been practicing for quite some time, who um, had an understanding of the Dharma that, we could say is pretty well developed or pretty experienced, didn't know how to react to what was going on. And I think part of that came from the fact that this was a blind spot that a lot of people had. And I liked
Hmm.
this concept of blind spots, that I'd actually heard Bhikkhuni from Blue Cliff Monastery, one of the nuns there, talk about how we have these blind spots, even if we're, pretty realized practitioners. And when we encounter them, the most important thing is to see our response to them. And unfortunately, I have to say, a lot of the response that came from Buddhist communities to people realizing they had these blind spots was silence,
Hmm.
unfortunately, or delusion. So, sort of not recognizing that this was a blind spot that they had. And also a lot of suppression and spiritual bypassing.
Hmm.
So these, the killings, these events were traumatic for a huge chunk of the population, and especially for practicing Buddhists, who are people of color. There were people that were searching for support and searching for understanding. And in a lot of the communities that even I am a part of or have been a part of, the response of support and of listening and of understanding and compassion just wasn't there.
Mm,
And, in some ways, I don't mm, blame anyone for that response because systemic racism, by its nature, is sort of this insidious thing that creeps beneath the surface in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, it was a letdown that Dharma practitioners who speak very eloquently about compassion and right view
right.
and emptiness
Uh-huh.
couldn't find the words to really address the situation.
Uh-huh.
And there was a lot of talk about, well, it's politics, or, it's all like fabrication, sankaras. It's, not something to be ruffled by. But that to me was just a complete misunderstanding of the Buddhist teachings, when it didn't have anything to do with politics actually at all. It simply had to do with how people were being treated in their regular daily lives. And Buddhist practice is about changing our daily lives. So to me, it seemed natural that Buddhists and Buddhist monks in particular would have something to say about what was going on.
Sure. And so why do you think that was? Why do you think it was that there are these some of your spiritual friends, these developed spiritual communities, some great teachers and practitioners, people who can speak very eloquently, probably from experience as well, about topics like compassion and overcoming suffering, that when they became confronted with something, again, going back to your words, something happens that we simply can't ignore, that they have to face this suffering, that then this blind spot comes and overtakes them. And I was listening to you talking, I was thinking that this blind spot exists, but more important than the fact of the nature of the blind spot and the conditions that created it is the way we choose to respond to it. That's the thing that we have
Mm-hmm.
power to right now, is not looking back to blame or feel guilty or whatnot about the blind spot that developed, but taking
Right.
responsibility and owning how you can be curious and respond to that at the time. That some of these spiritual practitioners and teachers, from your perspective and what you saw and heard, that when they were confronted with this challenge at this time, many of them, some of them probably were able to, and we'll get to that in a moment, but many of them, as you saw, were simply not able to use their Buddhist training, their meditative training, to be able to respond and examine with curiosity and openness and even rawness the nature of this blind spot. They kind of failed this test, so to speak. So
Mm-hmm.
what do you attribute to that? Why were they unable to do so?
I think part of it has to do with really a perspective on what we consider to be reality. And I've spoken about this a little bit too, especially in reference to gender and sexuality. But there tends to be sort of this view that there is Dharma practice, and the Dharma is about dispelling delusion, greed, and hatred. And that's in reference to, is the common view, at least that I've seen. That's in reference to the things that cause us suffering. And unfortunately, for a lot of people who are part of, let's say, the status quo, that category of things that cause suffering is not that expansive. So the view is limited. So we might understand, for example, a teaching on not self. And so we have the teaching on not self, and we can apply that to our anger. We can apply that to our identity in our profession, our identity as a lawyer, as a teacher, as what have you. We can apply that to our relationships, to our family. For someone who's part of the status quo, that's unfortunately maybe as far as that goes. Now, for people who are not in that privileged position, I found anyway that you start to realize that the teachings on, say, not self or any of them, impermanent suffering, it applies to every aspect of our life. And that applies to gender, which unfortunately a lot of people take for granted as something stable, something permanent, something that has meaning. And I think, unfortunately, that also happens with race. So the response, that came from Buddhist teachers that were less than, I would say, helpful, unfortunately, mostly came from white practitioners or non people of color, or from people of color who are in a more privileged position. And so the idea that race could be a source of suffering, or race and ethnicity as something that is not um, say an essential part of reality, just doesn't occur. At least that's what I've seen in my experience. So you don't necessarily apply the teachings of not self to being white or to being black or to being XYZ,
Mhm.
because there's this idea that that's part of how things are. But the way that I've understood the Buddha's teachings, and I would say the way that people of color have also come to the teachings, is that you realize that none of it is who you are. But you have people in society, in the world, who take whatever marker it is, your gender, your sexual orientation, your skin color, your nationality, whatever it is, and use that as a tool for oppression, use that as a tool of violence. And so when that happens, the natural response, at least the way that I see it, is to say something about that, to do something about that, and to talk about how the teachings show that it's that activity of taking something that has no inherent meaning, giving it meaning, and especially giving it a meaning that's used to harm others, that's what's unwholesome. It's not unwholesome to recognize that that's happening in the first place. But
Right.
unfortunately, I saw that the response a lot of times was this idea, well, there's no racism because everything is empty, or skin color doesn't matter, or we're all colorblind. But that ignores the fact that um, that's not what the issue is. The issue is that there are people that don't believe that and who are doing a lot of unwholesome things based on this idea.
Right. And that's a really interesting middle path you're charting. And I want to go a little deeper into that. You made this Facebook post a little while back reflecting on the role of discrimination on the road to liberation. I'd
Mhm.
like to read it in full because there's a lot here. So I'm going to be quoting from this post that you made on this topic. You begin, quote, "If we've ever been discriminated against, marginalized, or oppressed, we might conclude that there is something wrong with us. We should be lighter skinned or manlier, more of this or that, whatever the status quo expects of us. We might believe that we're flawed and need to be fixed or even destroyed. But the truth is, there's nothing wrong with us at all. Instead, the Buddha is very clear that this messaging comes from the system, and it is the system that is flawed. I can imagine a slave at the time of the Buddha asking, the system, what is the system? And the Buddha might have replied, it's the system of greed, the system of hatred, the system of delusion. In other words, it's the defiled instinct to create and defend a self that is normal while all other selves are alien. And in the name of defending this pristine and pure self, we harm others with our thoughts, with our words, with our actions, all because we cling to this idea of a precious me that reigns supreme. Don't consume the messaging. Don't believe the delusion. Your skin color, your gender, your orientation, any identity at all does not define you. And anyone who tries to use these labels to hurt you are quite lost in the prison of the system indeed. End quote. So these are quite powerful words indeed, and they give so much insight on where you've landed in trying to understand these dynamics of bias and prejudice within the framework of the Buddhist teachings.
Mm.
Before and after you found the Dhamma, I imagine you've experienced racism in the world, and I'd like to know if any shift happened here. So, for example, how did you respond to racism before you took up a Dhamma practice? And once you developed yourself firmly on the path, how have the Buddhist teachings spoken to you in being able to understand this experience in a different, perhaps a deeper way?
Mm. Yeah, I think in some ways when I wrote that post, that was in some ways for my younger, more immature self. I think I'm still a bit immature, so don't take that as me saying I'm more evolved. But yeah, when I was younger, I definitely took these things personally. Um, if I had an instance where someone was discriminating against me, or if there was some perception that I had that I needed to change who I was in order to fit in, I would internalize that. Um, I would take that, say, as normal, and me as the abnormal person trying to reach normalcy, needed to adapt. And I remember, for example, it seems silly, but wanting like colored contact lenses. So my eyes are dark brown, for example. Um, and I was like, oh, but light colored eyes are so much better, or at least different colored eyes. Um, Something that would be more sort of either exotic or fit more in with sort of like societal expectations, or even dyeing my hair, or changing the way that I spoke to fit in with a certain sort of refined segment of society. And so I struggled a lot in my 20s, especially with sort of figuring out, this is the messaging that I was receiving. This is where I was. And so was I supposed to then change who I was to fit the messaging? And if I did that, would I finally, be accepted? Would I finally be happy? And as I started to practice Buddhism, especially, but even just growing up and experiencing more of the world, I started to realize that, well, one, the messaging, like I said, was flawed. It was based on wrong view. It wasn't based on wisdom, and it was simply based on preferences and ideas of what um, something good and true and right was. But those ideas weren't grounded in anything real. But then I also realized that actually acceptance was not going to come from changing myself to fit any of these things. It didn't matter how light my skin got, it didn't matter what color my hair was, how I spoke. Nothing that I changed about myself would bring me the happiness that I was seeking. And part of that was because that system of discrimination is designed to keep people out always. No matter how one adapts or changes, you'll always be on the outside. Because, like I said, it's the system that's flawed. And from a Buddhist standpoint, too, I was thinking that by acquiring and changing and doing all these things and setting up this nice sandcastle would bring me the happiness that I was finally seeking, the acceptance I was finally seeking. But doing that was an act of delusion, because that was not where I was going to find happiness. That was not where I was going to find acceptance. And so I was setting myself up for defeat. And it was really learning from teachers, especially like Thich Nhat Hanh, who talk about developing a sense of worth that comes from within, which is a very common, Buddhist teaching. But really taking that to heart and realizing that there is almost nothing, no validation from outside that's going to um, suddenly make us the person that we want to be, but rather the validation has to come from within. And the validation, that sort of validation is hard won. And for some people, it's a lifetime process too of realizing um, that the most important thing, at least the way that I've seen it as far as development is concerned, the most important thing is to be a person that we ourselves can be happy with. Because no matter, what place we run to, whether we're in New York or Tokyo or Yangon, wherever we are, we realize that it's this body and mind that we're carrying with us. And I think for me, one of the most useful things that I've gotten from having been to all of these different places is seeing how um, I'm carrying myself around everywhere I go. And if I spend all of my time trying to satisfy someone else, trying to fit someone else's idea of how I should be, I'm the one that's going to be stuck with me at the end of the day. So I need to at least make sure that that person that I'm stuck with is the person that I um, want to be with, if that makes sense.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Yeah. And in this post as well, the one I read above, you also emphasize the suffering that's caused by this clinging to self,
Mm,
which you link to identity and ultimately concluding that any label at all is inherently inadequate.
mm-hmm,
And that's the point I want to ask about because this is the point to me where worldly and spiritual matters really come together
mm-hmm,
and digging into more of what you meant here, and maybe if this was a developmental essay and what that you wrote at a time, kind of where you're at now with it. So
mm-hmm,
especially in the progressive movement today, this issue of identity is so important.
mm-hmm,
Voicing one's identity, respecting the identity of others, it's paramount,
mm-hmm,
especially after so many have experienced years of microaggressions, overt and systematic racism, often even violence, obviously discrimination of all kinds. So embracing one's identity with this real sense of like pride and ownership, it's considered an important element, not only in one's healing, but also this kind of affirmation of one's right to define personal identity in the unique way that one wishes to appear in the world and be recognized as such.
mm-hmm,
And yet, in Buddhist practice, we're taught that ultimately there is no I, that the more one clings to this illusion of some kind of fixed personhood, the further away one is going from understanding the true nature of anatta, which really is one of the keys for coming out of suffering. So it seems that at this point, there's this subtle yet challenging conceptual dissonance.
mm-hmm.
So, first, I'm just curious, how do you reconcile these disparate perspectives yourself at this point in your spiritual development?
Hmm. I think for me, I don't necessarily see them as discordant or even in conflict because I see it sort of as a progression on the path to awakening.
Okay, right. Hmm.
So more rather, I should say, rather than take it as, an either or scenario, either you have this identity that you value, that you take pride in, that you want people to recognize and respect, or you
Hmm.
totally give up identification at all. Rather,
Right.
I see it as sort of this stepwise training, stepwise
Hmm.
progression of practice. I would liken it to, say, getting a degree, say in college, for example. So, as anyone, not anyone, but most people I think who have gotten degrees in university, once they've completed their 4 years, say maybe for a bachelor's, and start working, I think a lot of people have this realization sometimes that their degree didn't matter. That they're like, oh my gosh, I spent 4 years to get this degree. And look at me, in this job, either not using the degree that I have, or learning so much on the job that I didn't learn in my 4 years of university. Um, So for me, I had like a similar experience, but then I realized that the 4 years prior, there were a lot of valuable experiences, a lot of valuable teachings and practices that I did that altogether led to the point where I no longer um, actually needed a degree at all, because all of the things that I needed, I had gotten sort of through the process of doing all the things to get the degree. So it wouldn't make sense to tell somebody, say in their freshman class, oh, this all doesn't matter, just drop out now. Um, and you'll be able to do the exact same thing that I did after 4 years and getting the degree that I say I don't need. But rather, it was more of a process of seeing that, okay, these things that I did actually did have some influence on me, even if I didn't see the direct connection. And so with identity, in some ways, it's not an exact match, but I see it similarly, where you can't give up or let go of, maybe is a better phrasing. You can't let go of something you actually don't understand. You can't let go of something that is still uh, mm, painful, actually, I would say. You can't let go in a way that actually helps. So, sometimes people come to Buddhist practice and they say, I really, have trouble with food, for example. I'm really greedy when it comes to food. As soon as I start practicing, like tomorrow, I'm going to stop being greedy for food. I'm going to completely give up pizza and junk food. I'm going to stop snacking. I'm going to be healthy. And it lasts for a day or two, and then they fall back into their old habits of binging on whatever snack and food. And that's because they haven't let go of craving with wisdom or through actual understanding. Rather, they've let go through repression or ignoring. So when it comes to identity, the way that I've seen it, and at least how I've tried to understand it in my practice, is that it's similar. I have to understand what these conditions are. So identity is something conditioned. It's something um, that's made up of all of these different parts and components. And if I want to truly understand it, truly know what it's all about, then I have to look at it. And I have to look at it not with aversion, but also not with hunger, not with clinging. I have to look at it and just see it for what it is in order to understand it. And then I start to see, oh, coming from Jamaica, I've had all of these influences, and these are the things that I believe. But these beliefs come from having grown up in this time, in this place, with these parents, with this culture, and all these things just coming together, coming together, coming together. Um, and I can understand and appreciate and respect that that's my background, and this is the situation that I have. And then once I see that, I realize that I don't have to hold on to this thing for dear life. Um, I don't have to hold on to this thing as if that's all I'm about. And I don't have to hold on to it and protect it um, so dearly, if you will, because it's not something that I need to get defensive about, or it's not something that I feel shame or guilt or anything about. And then letting go becomes easier. And letting go to me is not rejection. So it's not, say, rejecting that I'm Jamaican, for example, or rejecting that I identify as male, or rejecting whatever. But rather, letting go is seeing that this is a condition that I have, but also that condition doesn't define me. There's actually no me that's there to be defined. And to me, I actually find that that's a much more liberating position to be in some ways, um, because then I'm not trapped. So there is beauty in owning one's racial identity. There's beauty in owning and valuing and respecting one's heritage, one's ancestors, one's sexual identity, gender identity. But the other side of the coin is that there can also be imprisonment there when you start to see that these things are who you are and you can't do anything to step outside of that, or you can't do anything to change that. But everything's constantly changing, everything's constantly in flux. And when we can hold these things loosely, or even better, not hold them at all, um, that's when I think we're getting closer to what the Buddha was talking about. But again, it's a progression. So I don't necessarily think that taking pride in one's identity is antithetical to the Buddha's teachings. What's antithetical to the Buddha's teachings, in my view anyway, is taking these things up and saying, this is all we will ever be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's what you're saying is there's some progression of coming to one's identity with a sense of pride and ownership and claiming it, but then through that progression, uh, after that healthy relationship with one's identity and with asserting it in society, that at some point in following the teachings, there's a letting go of that very ownership. Would that be a correct way to represent what you said?
Yeah. Um, a way of One way that I've heard it described is picking it up when it's useful and putting it down when it's not useful anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So we recognize, I haven't decided all of a sudden, I don't identify as Black, for example. So I walk out into the world and, that's my reality now. So you recognize that these things have meaning to different people, different times, different places, etc. And within that framework, um, you operate. But that's no different than speaking a language. That's no different than um, doing any other, say, activity in the world. But you don't hold on to it as something that is essential, I guess I would say, for your well-being and for your happiness, because ultimately it won't be able to be everything that you want it to be.
Right, right. And if you don't mind my asking, what are your feelings on the emphasis that some Buddhist groups in the West, especially the US, place on such issues as identity and race and gender and sexual orientation in their teachings? The perhaps outsized emphasis
Mm,
on bringing identity in to basic Buddhist practice and teachings.
mm. I think it's a reaction to years, maybe decades of erasure.
Hmm.
And to that degree, I think it's very important.
Hmm.
So, kind of dovetailing on what I had said earlier about sort of the status quo, um, for so long, there have been so many people that have, say, come to Buddhist practice, really inspired by the Buddha's teachings on liberation that's open to everyone, no matter what identity, what background. And for a lot of people that do have an identity that's not valued in society, that's very freeing. It's like, oh my God, finally, there's a place, there's a group of people, there's a community that are not going to make a big deal out of my identity. Finally,
Hmm.
there's somewhere where I can just be. And the just being, to me, that's that feeling of being able to just be is the feeling of letting go of identity. But unfortunately, for a lot of people who do have these identities that aren't valued, that are marginalized, when they do go to a space, even a Buddhist space, they realize that even if they have totally let go of reifying their identity, everybody else makes it a big deal. So to be the Black person in the group is an issue, to be the gay person in the group is an issue, to be the woman in the group is an issue, or whoever or whatever the case may be. And so nowadays we're seeing, sort of an outsized emphasis on identity. And I think
Hmm.
that's to counteract
Hmm.
all those years of one either ignoring or even outright discriminating against people with these identities.
Right.
But I think ultimately, for a lot of people, and I know this was for me, we do want to get to that place where it's not an issue, where you
Hmm.
can just be. But in order to do that, there has to be the recognition. There has to be the actual work done around what goes into making a space like that possible. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And as the previous questions I was asking you, they looked at the danger that can come on the spiritual path from building up an aggrandized sense of self. There's this problem on the other end as well. The Buddha's foundational teaching of non-self has led some white meditators, as you referenced before, to justify a kind of dispassionate attitude of spiritual bypass,
mhm.
claiming that they're only trying to attend to the ultimate reality of their life. In their disengagement, they look past the tangible reality of race and ethnicity in an unequal society. And along with that, this implicit as well as explicit bias and prejudice that goes hand to hand, and the obvious suffering that can arise from that. The result of this disengagement is really what allows the injustice to flourish in silence and in blind spots.
Yeah.
So, looking at it from this other side, and you mentioned this a little bit before in your disappointment with how some of the spiritual traditions responded, the Buddhist spiritual traditions responded in 2020 with some of the protest movement and the social justice. What would be your teaching around those that might still be caught in this attitude of spiritual bypass? If there was a way to talk to them directly and have them work on examining these blind spots, how would you want to go about that? And what would you want them to look at?
I would say the biggest thing that I found that anyone can work on when it comes to addressing blind spots is their ability and their skill in listening, actually. So
Hmm.
the tricky nature of blind spots, unfortunately, is you don't know it's a blind spot until someone points it out. I remember in high school, we did this test. I don't know if you did it as well or if it's common here, but it was sort of like this exercise in biology class where you look at this image and you'll be able to see where one of the blind spots, your literal blind spots, is in your eye. So everyone has at least this one blind spot that the brain just sort of fills in the data for. But if you use these images, this particular set of images, you'll be able to see clearly that there's just a gap. It's very small, but there's just like a point where there's no data coming in. So it just looks like gray fuzz because the mind doesn't know what to put there. And it's similar in this case where you can spend your whole life thinking you've really understood um, these situations. And then someone comes along and tells you, "Oh, hey, actually, no, this is how it is." Um, so rather than give into defensiveness, which is a natural reaction, everybody wants to be right. Everyone wants to be, wise and perfect. Instead of trying to defend that desire to be right, take a moment and be like, huh, am I sure about this then? Is this a blind spot? And especially if this is something, say, around race and it's coming from a person of color, even more of a reason to listen, even more of a reason to be like, they most likely have a perspective on this that I don't have, that I can't have, that I haven't had. And so, listening, at the very least, listening doesn't mean accepting right away, and it doesn't mean giving up one's own opinions, but it means being open to the possibility that there is a blind spot there, that there is some area where one can learn. And to do this with humbleness, and realizing actually, no, we're imperfect. We don't know everything. And then the other part of this too, I would say, is to be resilient. So the Buddha's teachings are about kindness and compassion and wisdom and openness. But there's also a very large part of the teachings that is about building endurance, building equanimity and resilience, especially in the face of uncomfortable feelings, especially in the face of anger and strong emotions. And I say this because a lot of people of color, especially who have been harmed by discrimination, by acts of racism, are angry, are upset, are hurt, and they've been traumatized for a lot of people their whole lives by people who don't understand them and by people who, in a lot of cases, have a lot of animosity from them. So it's natural that that's going to be expressed. And I've seen in some spiritual groups this sort of inability to hold space for that, this inability to deal with the anger and frustration that people have. And that inability leads to then shutting down, whether it's shutting down a conversation, shutting down um, the work that needs to be done to actually move through all of these things. So, being able to listen and also to be able to sit with the discomfort that's inevitable, especially for generations of oppression that people have experienced. Those two skills are going to be what will actually help to diminish the blind spots, and will help people to be um, sort of positive um, influences in their communities. Because the last thing that honestly a person of color wants to do is to constantly be the person who's pointing out all of these injustices, to constantly be the person that seems like they're the only one that cares. But actually, it's something that everybody is going to have to do. And in order to do that, it's going to take some grit. And there's the soft side of the Buddha's teachings, and there's also the part of the teachings that call on us to actually um, do the difficult things that lead to good results.
Yeah, right. It's a really beautiful answer when you're talking about active listening and just taking, because listening is kind of an act of not doing. It's kind of a non-activity of trying to do the right action or be the right thing. It's really just taking a moment to open yourself to something else. And it strikes me hearing that we've done, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5 episodes in this series
Mm,
exploring Dhamma and race. And when we release them, we obviously put them out on various social media platforms. And these always get a pretty charged response. And there's a charged response both ways. There's a charged response from people that are extremely grateful and thankful that these are being brought in the open. So I do want to identify that people of all
yeah.
backgrounds that are expressing that. But there is also a charged response from people that are very upset that we would even go in this direction as a podcast platform focused on
Mm,
Dharma and Buddhism, and just feel it's an affront to the very sense of what practice should be. And it's putting it's it's an angle that's taking us away from the essential practice we should be doing. And as I think about those kind of comments coming and I reflect on what you said about active listening, that response really seems to be saying, I am not going to active listen to this. I am not the one thing that you're suggesting, to take some time to hear these views, to open yourself to listen. That is one of the most violent and obvious responses you get back, that is announcing to the world, uh, of course I'm not going to listen to it. You shouldn't even be putting it in the ether for other people to listen to.
yeah.
And so I think that that's where I want to kind of double down on the conversation that we're having, that by talking about these things and putting it out there, everyone who is listening at this point has an opportunity to engage in that sense of active listening. They have the opportunity to sit with that discomfort, to take a personal reflection of that blind spot. And the interesting thing about the blind spot, again, as I was listening to you and as I was reflecting about it, is that the blind spot is not actually us. I mean, it's moha, it's ignorance. It's something that we are unaware of. And but the blind spot is not us until we claim it as us. And so
Mhm.
if we start to get defensive with our blind spots, well, then that does become a part of us. That does become something painful that we have to hold on to and defend. But if there's a way to be able to have these conversations and move forward where active listening can probe these things that we don't know, and ways that we've acted without proper knowledge of, and the whole essence of Buddhism and meditation is coming in contact with dark areas of all kinds, that it was like, well, I've been doing this my whole life, and every time I do this, like, it just results in this measure of suffering, and I just keep doing it. Like, that's every wisdom along the step. And so if this is a blind spot like any other, maybe it's a bit more painful or
Mhm.
raw, but I really like what you say, that one of the things you'd like to say to people that are engaged in some level of spiritual bypassing is not to call on them to do something, or to engage in some way, or to be something or represent something, but the opposite of that, to call on a sense of not doing, and of opening to listening to conversations like these and many others that can inform some of those blind spots, and can help them to not identify with what doesn't need to be identified with.
Yeah, totally. It's not personal. In some ways, it makes even more sense. Of course, I would have XYZ blind spot. Of course, I wouldn't be able to see this, and to be able to actually say that, to be like, oh yeah, of course, I have this ignorance here, this delusion. I mean, it's in the teachings, millennia old.
Mhm,
But of
mhm.
course, then you can do something about it. And then the something that you do about it comes from a place of wisdom rather than a place of ignorance.
Right. Right. I want to ask about your specific experiences of being a Black monk.
Mhm.
Before that, however, I just want to briefly tell you about two other guests that we spoke to in this series. One was an African American meditator who went to Burma, and while at a monastery, he was literally kicked by a monk.
Mm.
He actually went to Burma with aspirations of ordination, which would involve cutting off his dreadlocks, and
Mm.
was especially motivated to think about ordaining because people would see a Black monk. And he himself had never encountered or even heard of a Black monk in the world. And he thought it would be really cool to represent that.
Mm.
After the assault, however, he decided not to ordain.
Mm.
But he was very circumspect in showing the proper respect to the monastery before leaving, as he was still quite conscious that he was probably the only Black meditator they'd ever seen, maybe the only Black person, and that those Burmese monastics, he wanted to leave them with a good impression.
Yeah.
Second story is that we spoke to Bhante Panya, who's an African
Oh
American monk in
yes.
Thailand, and he, when we spoke to him, he had mentioned that in his travels he had never met another Black monk in his life,
Mm.
and spoke about that difficulty. He talked about experiencing intentional as well as unintentional acts of bias in Southeast Asia,
Mhm.
and how he aspired in his role to bring these teachings of liberation to his community. So, given the reflection that you've obviously done about identity, and we were talking more general before, so getting more personal with this question
Mm.
and examining self and anatta, in what ways, if at all, does race play into your experience in your life as a monastic?
Um, I mean, I have to say right now, I'm pretty sheltered. So I ordained in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I haven't been many places since
Right.
then.
Hmm.
Um, but obviously, no matter where you are, and no matter what you do, especially because here at Empty Cloud, we're somewhat maybe more public facing than some monasteries. So we do things
Right.
on YouTube and in the
Right.
community, and people are always
Hmm.
coming here. So there's always when you interact with people, anybody, there's always moments for any sort of situation to arise. And so for me personally, I haven't so far, experienced any sort of overt discrimination or bias in that way. But there's obviously hmm, unintentional and sort of the microaggression sort of things that happen, and that happens anywhere, everywhere with whoever.
Right.
Um, and so, in some ways, in those situations, also because I'm one of the resident monastics here, dealing with them, there's a different power dynamic, if you will, than if I were
Hmm.
visiting
Sure. Sure.
somewhere or just being somewhere. Um, but for me, dealing with them has obviously been a practice of, well, it's been an ongoing practice, but it's a practice of being able to maybe vocalize something without um, shutting someone down, I guess, if you will. And fortunately, here too, because the resident monastics here, we've made a commitment to sort of um, confront our blind spots and also to help other people to see their blind spots. So there's certain things that we do intentionally and
Hmm.
preemptively
Hmm.
to sort of address things before they come up. So, for example,
Hmm.
well, I was, but another monk recently ordained, but I was the most junior monk here at the monastery. Um, but for example, the traditional way, say, of maybe a seating arrangement in a Dharma hall or lining up for the meals is by seniority. Um, if we had done that sort of setup here, I would have been at the end of each line, and I'm the only Black person here. I was the only person of color here. So, from an outsider's perspective, even though all of us here know, for example, I'm the most junior monk and we're using, if we were using that traditional model, we would know that that's what the case is. To an outsider, what they would see is three or four white monastics at the front of the line and me, the Black monastic, at the very end. So, we made an
Hmm.
intentional decision that I would not be at the end of the line.
Hmm.
Um, for that, for alms round, for those kind of things, I believe I'm like third or something like that. Um, one, because that way of doing things is not, it's not a requirement anywhere. It's a convention.
Hmm.
But two, it also, apart from addressing that maybe unintentional sort of discrimination that could arise, if not in ourselves, then in other people, it also makes people like think and stop and question and be like, oh, wait a minute. Um, why do we do things, this way?
Hmm.
We do the same thing with female practitioners. So again, quote unquote, traditionally, you would have, say, female ordained monastics at the after the male monastics, but here we mix things up.
Hmm.
Um, so as far as my experience as a Black monk, I've had the privilege, I have to say, to recognize of being in a place where we're constantly aware of these things and also try to address them either before they come up or as they come up.
Hmm.
I have to say, though, I do, as a layperson, I have experienced discrimination in certain spaces as well, similar to the previous people you've mentioned that you
Hmm.
interviewed.
Hmm.
Um, And it is, discouraging too, especially in the case of that individual who is discouraged from ordaining, at least in that place, to hear about situations like that. And I also heard in what you were sharing too, it's both a huge, blessing, if you will, to
Mhm.
represent for somebody a possibility,
Right.
that
Yes.
a Black person,
Mhm.
an African American, a person of color, a non-Asian person of color could be, in this role. And at the same time, though, there is so much pressure.
Oh,
I heard in, the case of the person at the Burmese temple trying to leave graciously, too, is that pressure of carrying the um, uh, impression that others might have of
right.
people who look like you on your shoulders. So
Mhm.
everything that you do is a reflection of XYZ person. And I know that for me, that's, it's a balancing act.
Mhm.
Obviously, even though we do have this identity, we do have this appearance and this background, we also have our own individuality and our own needs. And it's about, seeing where we can honor and respect both, but also, unfortunately, seeing where sometimes we have to do what's best for ourselves, or sometimes when we have to do what's best for others. Um, yeah.
That's really interesting because I was just reflecting. You spoke about your early years as like monkhood, the decision of monkhood. One of the most important moments of that act for you was that you were making a decision for yourself and not pleasing other people, as you mentioned you had a tendency to do. And
Mm.
now you're actually saying that as a monk, as a monk of a monk of color, as a black monk, that there could be this added pressure to this burden to represent, being someone in robes from that background, which is less than usual.
Mhm.
So, do you feel that pressure? Has that pressure been an issue for you of having this sense come again that you're having to take into account other people's needs or feelings and balance that with your own desire to live a life in robes, which is a hard enough challenge?
Yeah. Yeah, if I'm being honest, I would say that um, there is some pressure there.
Hmm.
Because I can't speak for every monastic, obviously, and I'm a baby monk,
Hmm.
but I came to the practice because there are obviously things that I wanted to work on for myself, and things that I still need to work on. And so there can be this thought, oh, finally, I can put down everything. I can finally focus on the things that I need to do that will benefit both myself and others. But this view that it's, I finally have the time to do that. And then you realize, like, oh my God, now, now I represent XYZ for so many people. And it is different than being, say, a monastic of um, Asian descent, a male monastic of Asian descent in particular,
Right.
because the expectation, though it exists from the status of being a monk, it doesn't exist from being the status of, say, being the Thai monk. All the hopes and dreams of the Thai people aren't riding on your success as a monastic, for
Mhm.
example. And I would say, though, too, that the same thing, curiously, even though white monastics are also, a minority in the majority of monastics, the same feeling isn't there. And I think
Mhm.
that has a lot to do with the way racial dynamics are in this country in particular. But for, a white monk, that pressure is not there, whether they um, sink or whether they're successful. It says nothing on the ability of, say a white person to be successful as a monastic. But there
Mhm.
is that underlying pressure there for a black monk, for a female monk as well.
Mhm.
That if you aren't in this way or successful or this, and that, then it's a reflection of, oh, that's why there is not that many, so and so monastics. And so for me, it's still like a balancing act, honestly, because I also don't know what's in people's heads. And some days there is like this pressure to be the perfect monk, which I'm sure everybody has,
Mhm.
but especially more so because you represent this thing for these people. And then there's also the pressure to reach out to and help people similar to you as well. Um, but then there's also those moments where you just want to be able to be your imperfect self and get support in
Right.
that, and to do
Right.
that without judgment. Um,
Mhm.
And those are the cases where I actually find that it's important. You were speaking before about groups that put an emphasis on identity. Those are the spaces where it's important, I think, for people to have that kind of space, because then you can be your imperfect self, and there's
Mhm.
no judgment there. So, for example, I've spoken to Bhante and other African American monastics, for example, and there is this shared understanding that we can have.
Mhm.
You can be more vulnerable, if you will, in those spaces because of that shared understanding and that non-judgment. But yeah, I would say it's a balancing act, but it's useful and it's wholesome, but it's also good, I think, to speak about. So thanks for asking, because that is an aspect of monastic life that people don't always realize is present.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sorry to hear about that added burden and pressure that you have to your day and to your practice. Yeah. So we spoke to your good friend Ayasoma on an earlier podcast, and as you know, she
Yeah.
was the one that put us in touch for this interview. And she referenced how Empty Cloud Monastery chose intentionally to involve itself directly in the social justice movement in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and how monks and supporters from your monastery actively participated in Black Lives Matter protests. It's
Mhm.
long been this debate, the extent to which Buddhist monastics should involve themselves in the external affairs of society. We talked about
Mhm.
this with Ayasoma, and for her, choosing to be engaged was part and parcel of her Buddhist practice. So, for you
Mhm.
personally, as someone who has taken robes yourself, what factors would you consider in determining if and how to be involved in a more social external way?
To me, it always comes back to um, an essential question that honestly the Buddha encourages anybody to ask about anything that they're about to do. And the question is it wholesome or is it unwholesome? And I always try to just come back to that whenever I find that I have a dilemma, or even something simple like, is it wholesome or is it unwholesome? Is it for the benefit of myself and other people, or for the detriment? And when I can ask myself that question, and most of the times the answer is pretty clear, um, then the answer is clear. The compass points north in the right direction. And for something like the Black Lives Matter movement, that was quite clear, making it clear that discrimination, hatred, killing, violence is unwholesome, and telling people that it was a no-brainer. Actually, that's like one of the easiest decisions to make in 2020 of things to talk about, is
Mm-hmm.
to say that that is not in line with Dhamma, and that it's important to know that, because it was surprising. Actually, sometimes we think that if we stay silent about something that we're helping.
Hmm.
But sometimes staying silent creates the conditions for confusion. And in the confusion, there's conditions for people to develop wrong view or misinterpretation. So if something's happening and we think that when we're Buddhist practitioners, we've given up religion. This is a spiritual practice, or
Right.
whatever. That people don't look to us for guidance. It's not like church. We're not priests. We're not pastors. We're just doing our meditation thing and sharing a few teachings here and there. But we're totally missing the fact that a lot of people do look to us for guidance on how to live, on how to um, be good human beings, actually. So when there's a situation that arises and there isn't um, advice, there's no teaching on that topic, then what happens is there's space for people to create their own opinions about something that may or may not be in line with Dharma. And so, I've heard say, Buddhist monks aren't supposed to be involved in society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we're already involved in society. The
Mhm.
fact that we're talking to lay people means that we're involved in society. Um, the question isn't whether we're involved in society. The question is whether we're practicing well. And I don't think um, the two necessarily have anything to do with each other. But so when we're interacting with people who are living in the world and we're teaching them things that are supposed to be helping them to live in the world, then it seems natural that just as we would give advice on how to have a wholesome relationship, just as we would give advice on how to be kind and generous, then we would most certainly give advice on how to be accepting of other people, on how to be compassionate. So for me, it wasn't there was actually no conflict like whatsoever. I found it confusing that it was a source of conflict for some monastics. Still is. Um, yeah, I don't quite understand, to be honest. Maybe I'm naive. I am a junior monastic.
No, it's really interesting because obviously when Buddhist practice has come to the West, it's come the main form that we've seen is in intensive meditation retreats, and that's been kind of the exclusive form in the last half century that people have taken to the practice, and often those intensive retreats involve some form of noble silence, and so I think we in the West and in the US are very much still in our infancy stage of figuring out how we integrate this into a greater whole and into our greater being. And so the guidance that might work in one limited type of Buddhist experience of a silent meditation retreat cannot be applied to the way we deal with all parts of waking life. And it when we have this conversation, I always think back to this interview that I had on this podcast with Sway Win. And Sway Win is a Burmese former political prisoner who has spent his career as an activist and a journalist speaking up um, against injustice in his own country in Myanmar. And he's also a very dedicated meditator. And while in prison, he had his own practice. And when I asked a variation of this question to him, he smiled and said something like, I would love to keep quiet and just practice meditation. I would really love to do that, but I cannot be silent with this thing happening. I have to speak up. And so there's this balance of of using wise discernment to know when you have to choose to keep silence and to look internally, and when is the time to engage in the world. And it's this sense of injustice and things not being right, this is not exclusive to certain conditions of one country or one time. This is the central teaching in the Buddha's in what the Buddha taught is that we do live in imperfect times. This is a constant anywhere that you live, and so there is this constant balance, like Sui Win said, of when when do you not as a person that's seeking certain kinds of reforms and just society, when do you have to relinquish this noble silence to
Mm.
speak up and use your voice in a way that will affect change and speak out for those that are being harmed and suffering? And when is the moment when silence is the wise decision to make? And there's no clear answer for that because it depends on a number of things. Obviously, if you're practicing meditation, living an ethical life, that will better and better inform your views, but it's certainly not a blanket statement on either side of which one you come down on.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I liked what they said about they would love to keep silent. It's so true. I think a lot of people who would like to see good change happen in the world, they would love to just be sort of quiet all the time. But that's not, the conditions that we find ourselves in. But yeah, like you said, it is about seeing um, what's helpful. So yeah, it's not about, running ourselves ragged, shouting, screaming, talking about XYZ until we're blue in the face. But it's always like a give and take, I feel. Always an ebb and flow of silence and understanding,
Mhm.
and also speaking,
Right.
acting, and then assessing. So it's, not doing either, just sort of like plotting a track in the ground and just like wearing it down to, as deep as it goes, but actually seeing, well, I said these things and I did these things. What effect did that have both on myself
Sure.
and other people?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and if it wasn't helpful, then maybe I do need to be more silent, or maybe I need to act in a different way. And vice versa, with silence, like, was that silence actually helpful for myself and others? Have I actually gained something from not speaking or doing something? So always, yeah, always assessing whatever action or non-action is, they're both action.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
seeing, what are the fruits of what it is that we're doing or not doing.
Yeah, right. You referenced how different Buddhist traditions you saw in the US not responding to the moment in the way that you would have hoped for. It sounds like Empty Cloud did respond in that way. So, what has it been like being a part of a monastery that is in sync, at least it sounds like, with the way that you're approaching this, and that seems like it's a very welcoming space to bringing these different aspects into your practice and into what it means to follow this path.
Hmm. It's very It inspires hope, actually. And it's interesting because hope isn't necessarily something that I always fall back on. Nothing's wrong with hope per se, but I have a complicated relationship with hope. But in this particular instance, it's inspiring because there's a nihilistic sort of feeling that one can take sometimes from these events and these things that are happening. You look around, everything's on fire. Um, Nobody cares. Nobody seems to care. And the things that you're doing don't seem to make a difference. And so there can be this sort of like defeat that comes from that. This feeling that mm, it doesn't matter, or whether it matters or not, nobody seems to care. But being a part of a community that is doing something, and I won't say, I can't say we figured out the perfect thing to do or the best thing to do, um, but who is actually doing something and reflecting on something that can be done is inspiring, because then it's like, oh, there are people who do care. And there are people who are trying to figure out the best way through this mud. Um, And that seeing that and being a part of that is rejuvenating. It's refreshing. Um, and then I think that actually allows other people to, though, to see that it's possible. And it's possible to do something that's in line with the Dharma, in line with the teachings that we're all trying to follow to improve ourselves and to improve the lives of others. Um, and it's possible to do both. It's possible to do both. It's possible to practice well, and to practice well in a way that benefits everybody involved. Even if you want to expand the everybody to society or even to the world, it seems hard to fathom. Um, but I think it's even more possible nowadays, especially because people are so connected. All these ripples that we're making wherever we are actually do have the potential to turn into something huge, and that something that's huge can actually be very beneficial.
Right. And that leads right into my last question for you. That's looking at the times that we're in now and what happened in 2020 and where we're going and where the Buddhist teachings have something to offer all of us. So,
Mm,
as you know, American society, it's been gripped by these hardened divisions where
mm,
people on either side, they're hardly even agreeing on the same version of reality these days.
yeah.
Many people on both sides are feeling aggrieved, misunderstood, victimized, traumatized. It's difficult to have proper communication. So, during such times as these, what do you feel the teachings of the Buddha have to offer?
Honestly, I think they offer. It sounds trite, maybe, but the same thing that they've offered from the very beginning, which is a path to um, the end of suffering, actually. And it sounds lofty, but I've been reading through the suttas, the discourses of the Pali Canon in particular, and it always strikes me, how much of the discourses are about everyday life. I mean, obviously, there's a lot about and tailored to monastics who are trying very hard to achieve the highest goal as quickly as possible. But there's so many passages simply about wives and husbands and kings and slaves and homeless people who are just trying to figure out how to live their lives in the best way possible. And the Buddha is quite frank and quite clear about how to do that. And it's by living a life of generosity, generosity of time, material goods, but also of heart and spirit, and one of integrity. And a lot of the divisiveness that I would say we've seen has a lot to do with holding on. And so the Buddhist teachings are about letting go. And it's the type of letting go, unfortunately, it hurts in the beginning because it means we have to let go of our way of doing things. It means we have to let go of our feelings, our views, our opinions. We have to let go of the outcome that we want for ourselves. And the holding on to all of those things is at the root of the divisiveness. We want to be right. We want society to look the way we want it to. And we're the only ones, we think, have the answer to that. But if, even for a moment, going back to the deep listening, if for a moment we can put that down, actually suspend it, if not let it go, put it in the corner, put it in the cupboard. We know it's there. We can pick it up easily. Um, but for a moment, just putting it down and trying to see um, someone else's perspective and trying to see the perspective of somebody who has the same drives and motivations that we do, just like the chickens, the ones who also want to be happy, the people who also want a fulfilling and wholesome life, the people who are lost and confused and are trying to find some meaning um, for this mess we can call life that a lot of us didn't get a blueprint for when we were growing up. So all of these things I feel like are encompassed in the Buddha's teachings of letting go. If we're willing to actually, take him at his word when he says that letting go leads to happiness. It's one thing to let go in meditation for about an hour or even 8 hours on a retreat. But can we let go of the things that we're actually really holding on to? And for most of us, those are our opinions and our ideas and our perspectives. For most of us, that's where we should be really trying to let go.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us and to share. And best
Pleasure.
wishes with your continued monkhood and your monastery life there and
Yeah.
going forward. And thank you so much for taking the time to share with all of us here.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm glad um, there's a group like yours taking the time to discuss all of these different perspectives and all these different topics. Yeah, I mean, it shows that the Dharma isn't limited to, an on the cushion practice, even though that's important. But the things that we're doing, the attainments we're achieving, the fruits of our practice that we're benefiting from, they're not just for ourselves, but they're for so many countless beings.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. Being a small, mostly volunteer team, our production time for a single episode before the coup was sometimes as long as 4 months from start to finish. While we worked at decreasing the lead time, the fastest we were ever able to manage was just around 3 weeks. Yet during this current crisis, where even a single day's events can produce such shocking news and urgent needs, we simply don't have the luxury of time. So we have worked around the clock to substantially shorten the length of our production cycle. The turnaround for some episodes is now just 36 hours. However, we cannot accomplish this goal without your support. If you have found value in today's episode and think others might also benefit from this type of content, please consider making a donation so that we can continue our mission. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam